Welcome back to Woodworking by Chan. So this is the second video in our series on how to make a breadboard and outdoor wooden sign. So last time I left you, I just finished cutting all the pieces and then glued up the centerpiece together using a biscuit joint. So this is the final product that we have from last time, and today I'm adding the breadboard ends to it. So the first thing I do is I measure out how wide my breadboard ends are, and then I'm going to take about half of that, maybe an inch and a bit, as my tenons that I'm going to cut into or place inside the breadboard ends. So for this part here, I'm using my router bit. I'm trying to decide on which bit is going to give me the proper thickness for both my tenon thickness and the mortise thickness, because obviously they fit into each other. And then I have a marking gauge that's able to give me a tenon marking gauge. It basically has 2 pins in it. I'm measuring that, and then I'm using that measurement to find the center point of my breadboard end by making marks on both sides of the board, and then that way I know my mortise is going to be centered into the breadboard. Then I make my lines across it so that I know exactly where I'm going to router later on, and then I transfer the exact same line, same thickness, onto my actual plank itself. So right now I'm using my chisel to score across all the lines so that when I use my router, I try to prevent as much tear out as possible into the plank itself. But first I have to transcribe all the same lines across the entire board. So I use my square and then pencil mark it, ruler, and then I use my chisel to score off across all of those lines. This would be a great place to be using a marking knife. Unfortunately, I don't have one, so that might be a project later on down the road to build one. So once all the marking has been made or the scoring has been made, then I go straight to the router, and it's a plunge router that I have access to at the wood shop, and then I just simply router from the end all the way in towards where I mark my line. This is a long process and it takes a little bit of time, so I'm only showing you the one side of the one tenon end, but I repeat it 4 times across all 4 ends of the board. So once all the routering is done, it leaves a lot of dirt, dust. So I tried using the shop vac at school, and I realized that when you leave a shop vac to a bunch of teenagers, they probably don't do a very good job emptying it. As I tried, no suction was happening, so I unplugged it, I opened the lid, and lo and behold, it is absolutely stuffed to the brim. So this gave me another idea. Maybe I will build some sort of collection system where they can actually see the amount of dirt that they are using to pick up a shop vac so that they can actually clean it. Because right now they have no clue how full this thing is, as you can see when I lift this lid up. Amazingly, once the vacuum has been emptied, look how well it cleans. So unfortunately this was off camera, but I took the tenon ends and I cut them into smaller sections so that each plank on the board has one tenon attached to it. So this allows for expansion. So it's not one giant tenon, but it's four small tenons that allows for expansion as the wood meets different temperatures. So once I have the tenons all cut out, I use the same router bit that I used to measure for the earlier when I did the measurement earlier. I used that router bit to create the shoulder portion of the mortise. If you notice from before, each tenon was connected by a tiny little shoulder that was about half an inch deep. So I used that router bit and I create a full length across the mortise of half-inch deep for that shoulder part. And now to create the mortise for the actual tenon part, which unfortunately I don't have a router bit that's, an inch and a half or 2 inches deep. So therefore I have to take it over to the drill press and then slowly inch by or quarter inch by quarter inch slide that piece of wood along the drill press and drill all the way down, so that I end up with a bunch of holes that I will later chisel out to make square or rectangular mortises for the tenons to fit into. This is a slow process, it's meticulous, but it gets the job done. Again, I didn't show the chiseling out of the actual mortises, but once that was done, it was down to fine tuning. So I have a small little block plane that I'm using to fine tune the thickness of each of the tenons so that they will fit into the mortise as I have created them. It's easier to just thickness the tenons instead of trying to re-chisel the mortises. And then I'm using a quick little shoulder plane to clean off the shoulder part right there so that it will fit nicely as well. So it's the same thickness as the tenons themselves. And right about here, I noticed that the outside tenons are a little bit wide to fit in, so therefore I'm chiseling a tiny bit off the outer edge so that it will fit in nicely, and it gives it a little bit more room for the wood to expand once it hits the humidity and temperature differences. Now this part I truly enjoy because I like working with hand tools. Sometimes it's long and you prefer to use a power tool, but there's nothing that beats the feeling of using a hand plane on a piece of wood because you get such great satisfaction with just a tiny little piece of metal doing all of that work, and it's quite rewarding. So now I'm dry fitting. Once I know that everything fits properly, it is on to creating the holes that I will put the dowels into. So what I'm doing here is I'm drilling holes into each of the mortises that will also have corresponding holes in the tenons themselves. And these holes will hold dowels that will actually keep the breadboard ends onto the rest of the plank. Nothing is glued together except for the dowels to the breadboard piece. So the breadboard piece is not glued to the plank itself, and the dowels are not glued to the plank themselves. There's only one of the 4 dowels will be glued all the way through. The other 3 will just be glued to the top of the breadboard. This is to help with the wood expanding later on. So to allow room for the wood to expand, in 3 of the 4 dowel holes, I'm using a circular file or rat tail rasp to try and elongate them so that as the wood expands laterally, the dowels won't affect it. Once I have the breadboard ends hammered in, I'm off to cutting off the dowels that I will just put a little bit of glue on the very top portion of it so that once pushed in, only the top part of the dowel will be glued to the top surface of the breadboard themselves. So again, I cut each piece as I go, and then I glue just the top portion of the dowel so that only it is glued to the top of the breadboard. All except for the 3rd one down, which will be the next dowel that I do. It will be glued all the way through because it will be the only one that is glued to both the plank and the breadboard ends. And then once this is done, I repeat the process for the other breadboard on the other side. So that brings this portion of the video to a close. So the part 3, which will be the final part, will have the design being drawn, routed, and painted on it, and then the whole board finished. See you next time.